Okay, we're going on to chapter 5 on good old evolution. This one says, old classic one, if people evolved from monkeys, then why are there still monkeys? You know, people didn't evolve from monkeys, but we do share common ancestors. But anyway, and the other side says, if Americans came from English pilgrims, then why are there still Englishmen? So that does kind of give you an idea of the answer to that question that people pose. So we're going to start with with early ideas. So folks would look around themselves and go, where'd all this come from? And they would talk to their relatives. They would talk to their older relatives. Now, how far back can you go, relative to relative to relative, and get any kind of real coherent stories when nobody's writing anything down because nobody's invented writing yet? It's not going back very far. So, as much as anybody knew about the world had always existed in the form they saw around them, more or less, and it didn't go back that far because the stories didn't go back that far. So there was no need to explain how things change over time. And then when you get farther along, people started to dig in the ground. They started to pull fossils out. These rocks that look like bones. Rocks take a lot of different forms. Rocks that look like bones are not that hard to explain. But when you start to get rocks that look like articulated bones or entire skulls with teeth in the jaws and all that, then it's pretty obvious that you're looking at the remnants of an animal that was buried a long time ago, and somehow their bones either were or became rocky. But then again, people did know the world was a very wide place, and they only knew a little bit about what existed beyond their farthest reaches. So it's real easy to go, oh, these big old animals from the bones, our great-great-great-grandfathers must have eaten all of them and maybe driven them away. So they're out there. We just haven't found them yet. And that explains why very often as people started to draw maps of the world, there would be edges beyond which nobody really knew what was there. But you would see the inscription, here there be dragons. Well, why? Well, because people still assumed that these big creatures existed somewhere, and they have to have been beyond the edges of the known world. And they did keep expecting to run into them somewhere. And then as you get more and more of the world, you start to realize, wow, they don't seem to be out there anywhere. So now we're looking at stuff that existed in the past, but don't exist anymore. This one says, Alice, would you mind putting George Boy in the other room? Howard's allergic to great woolly mammoths. But here was the thing. It was one thing to pull dinosaur bones out. It took a while to connect dinosaur bones to anything still alive. But whole mammoth skeletons were being pulled out that were very obviously kind of elephants, but they weren't elephants. They had several differences between the mammoths and a bunch of other relatives similar to that and modern elephants. So much so that you could actually build a cladogram. Remember cladistics? Where up on the top, you've got elephant relatives that still exist today, but then you've got stuff that comes out of the ground as fossils, but you can't find them alive anywhere. This was one of the first big challenges to ideas that were being generated by the church. We think of the church being opposed to evolution, which most churches really aren't. You know, just really the fundamentalist churches don't like the idea of evolution, or then evolution of people. But the idea that things existed in the past that died away turned out to be a really big issue for the church. They thought that it was very blasphemous and contrary to the word of the Bible. You may think, huh? Here was the reasoning. The world was created in the Garden of Eden. Man was created imperfect, but everything else was perfect. Is that animals weren't given free will, they were perfect existers in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, they can't go extinct. They're perfect creations for the world as the world is. And so extinction turned out to be a really, really big deal. It was really fought by a lot of the popes and other things at this point. So much so that briefly, and it never really caught on, if you know your Bible, there's a lot of repetition in the Bible. And one of the things that repeats is the creation story. They tell it, and then they tell it again. And some people go, well, all this stuff that we're finding that's no longer around, that was the first creation. And what we're living in is the second creation. And, but as I said, it never really completely caught on, never became church doctrine. But it was, you know, people trying to, again, fit the world that they were discovering into the world that they believed, which is going on to this day. People started to study what they were getting out of the ground. Layers of rock that when you dug at it, you could find fossils of things that live in the water. These were layers of rock on land, but they were full of shells and teeth and exoskeletons, things that are fairly hard, that obviously had been buried in sediment at some point and had picked up minerals to become rock. We call that sedimentary rock. If you look at pictures that the book connects to, there's pictures of all these layers. And they found that each layer had a characteristic mixture of certain types of fossils. But you didn't get all the layers every place. Why? Well, because sediments are built on the bottom of bodies of water, and bodies of water don't last forever. When the body of water is gone, then you stop getting sediment, so you stop getting buildup there. And so over here there could be, you know, these 3 layers, and over here there could be these 4 layers, and somewhere else there could be these 6 layers. But the thing is, you could match up this layer's bottom and this layer's top, and this layer's bottom and this layer's top, by matching the types of fossils that were in there. And of course, the farther down you go, right, the sediment on the top is new, the sediment on the bottom is old, the farther back in time you could go. And so they put together this type of list. It took them a while to get this many, but early on they were starting to put together, you know, layers of sediments. And then you get a geologist called Lyell. And of course the big question was, so how old are these things? And what Lyell did is he studied how quickly sediments build up on the bottom of a large body of water. Is it an inch a year? Is it a millimeter a year? You know, what is it? And then he could take the layers of these different layers of sedimentary rock and go, okay, this took this long to accumulate. We're going back in time. You know, down here it's taken this long for the layers above that to accumulate. And he started to put ages on things, how far down they were and all that other stuff. Now, he's applying an idea that's a very, very common idea in science of this type. Now, you're writing the other stuff down, right? right? I don't write everything, especially when I'm telling little stories. I think the longest word you're going to need to know, uniformitarianism. Whenever you are faced with trying to figure out how something works that either goes back into the past or out into the recesses of space, how do you make sense of it? Sedimentary rock. Well, you take something that you know today, how quick does sediment build up? And then you apply it to the sedimentary rock. Now, the assumption is everything's uniform, that sediments built up at the same rate in the past that they built up today. One thing they didn't take into account is as things mineralize, they compress. So their numbers were off until people started to factor that in. But it's an assumption that things always continue in the future, in the past, to work at the same rates. You know, the way that stars and such develop that we can see nearby matches the way that stars develop that are much farther away, which we are seeing from much farther back in time. So uniformitarianism applies to a lot of different sciences. And it kind of amounts to, well, we don't really know how it worked. This is going to be the basis for our best guess. Molecular clocks work that way. It's the assumption that mutations always accumulate at the same rate, and so you can use it like it was a ticking clock, comparing the number of mutations on this family versus this family. Now, of course, that's probably turns out not to be true. Mutation rates are weird. Even modern mutation rates vary from species to species. And what drives mutations can change over time is that our magnetic field fluctuates. It protects us from radiation from space. Any period of time where the radiation levels are higher, the mutation rates would be higher. There's all sorts of weird stuff that we wind up with. But again, this was the best they could come up with. And they started to figure out, okay, the Earth is not just, a few generations old, it's thousands and then millions. And then as they accumulated more data, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years old. And now the way that we figure it, as far back as we can find rocks from the very formation of the Earth, it's figured to be about 4.5 billion years old. And you don't find fossils in the really oldest rocks. But you do find them pretty quickly. Now, some people went, you go to the Grand Canyon. You go down to the Grand Canyon, you're a mile below the top, and it's all sedimentary rock, laid down over millions and millions and millions of years. There used to be an inland sea in North America, and it was there for a long time. But people go, well, no, it was all laid down by the Great Flood, what we call catastrophe explanations for things. A way to figure, okay, the Earth isn't really this old, this was all laid down. And there was a little bit of a battle there, and the catastrophe, there's a lot of things that don't really fit there. And the idea of catastrophic, unknown events that in this case were in a book but nobody had really experienced, they got very much thrown to the fringes. So later on, when people were trying to explain how evolution works, everything had to be explained in very, very slow incremental changes because that's the way the world worked around them. And the idea that evolution could happen quickly under some conditions took a long time to be accepted, over a century to be accepted, just because there was kind of a fight against catastrophism. And that happens, is that, remember postmodernism, the culture of science went, no, we don't want to listen to those kinds of explanations because we don't want to go down that road again. I'm listing some stuff that's I'm leading to good old Darwin, good old Charles Darwin, and giving you some of the ideas that were floating in the world that he knew about before he came up with his basic explanation for evolution. First is, people were starting to accept that things had changed over time. They didn't know why, but there weren't elephants, there were mammoths, and now there are elephants. How does that happen? You could see examples of that in all sorts of fossil lineages is the only word I can think of. Family trees. Here's another thing that people knew about. Okay, I've screwed this up. It's supposed to be artificial. I think that's what it's in. If you take the little blotted out part out, it's artificial. They knew that you could, by picking and choosing who in your livestock group, who in your crop group is giving you maybe bigger corn kernels, or growing faster, or growing bigger, or whatever it is you are giving you nicer flowers. You could pick the nicest flowers, and those are the only ones you're going to breed for your next run through. You could pick the biggest kernels, and those are the ones you're going to breed for your next run through. You're going to selectively pick who gets to reproduce in your agricultural group. And, pets too, dogs, and not so much cats, but a lot of different breeds of dogs were being developed through the 1700s and 1800s. And pigeons, people were developing lots and lots of types of pigeons. Darwin was a pigeon breeder. But the idea that you could change the nature of the group over time, change the average member, so that the average member of this dog breed was different than this dog breed. That German Shepherds weren't really wolfhoundish anymore. That was commonly accepted, that things could be changed if breeding was somehow selected for. Now, we now call that, eventually Darwin's idea was called evolution by natural selection, and then we started to call a bunch of things selection, and this is now called artificial selection, where people are choosing and producing changes over time by picking who gets to breed and who doesn't get to breed. But that was something people knew worked, is that it wasn't a big surprise. Now we're going to throw a couple of other people at this. Now, Malthus was not the nicest person in the world. He was an upper class British guy who lived in London. Now, the British Empire was expanding. A lot of people from around the empire were migrating to London and to England, and they were the wrong color. He liked them. He liked white people. They were not white people. And he started to fear for the nature of Britain. Right, there's a really old idea, right? That's gone completely away. Anyway, he wanted to warn people. But even then, these ideas were not considered, particularly great if you spoke them out loud. We didn't have chat rooms on the internet, or these Parlor, these weird places, or Twitter for that matter. So what he did was he wrote a paper about nature, about the effects of overpopulation on nature, as kind of a metaphor for what he thought he saw happening in England and what he feared would happen in the future, as these doggone brown people kept breeding and breeding and breeding. Hey, this was the idea. And he said, in nature, if the population grows out of control, you start to run out of food, famine. You wind up with a lot of conflicts over resources, because the resources get depleted, not just food, but other things. War. Well, you call it conflict in animals, but he was warning about war. And as you pack more and more individuals together, you raise the possibility of disease. People knew about this. They didn't necessarily know how diseases spread, but they knew that the more packed together a population was, the easier it was for diseases to spread. And what he was writing was there are natural controls over populations that kind of keep them from getting out of control. He was suggesting and hoping people would understand that in England, those controls weren't in place yet, but if people kept breeding like bunnies, they were going to wind up, using up all the food or increasing the diseases or, leading England into another war. He may have been hiding his bad ideas under good ideas, but these were good ideas. The idea that the environment has a control over any population group was another idea that kind of carried in Darwin's ideas onto his formation for how evolution works. Then you have good old LaMarck. LaMarck, poor guy, really smart fellow, really influential, had some really good ideas, but unfortunately he had a couple ideas that weren't so good, and that's what he's remembered for. The idea that evolution could be driven by advantages, that organisms with advantages would be more likely to survive and pass advantages on to their offspring. That's a really important idea, and it really carried through into Darwin. But LaMarck's idea about, okay, so where do the advantages come from? He went, well, it's all part of the plan. Religion was very, very powerful influence on a lot of guys we consider early scientists. And LaMarck thought that, yeah, evolution works, but it's all part of God's plan. And if an advantage is going to be useful, then God gives this group the advantage, at least starts them up with it. And they kind of roll from there. That things get better over time, that the world has been improving evolutionarily leading up to us because we're wonderful. We're at the very top. We're the best thing that evolution could produce. And that had to have been part of the plan. Because it's becoming pretty obvious that people hadn't always been in the plan. They were kind of latecomers to the party. So these a couple of ideas I'm going to put down here are not really part of how evolution works, but these are the ideas he's remembered for. The second one I'm going to talk about after I write this down. This one had to do with the idea that people didn't really know how genetics worked. If you know who Arnold Schwarzenegger is, he was a world-class bodybuilder before he became a movie star and went into politics. If you saw online that his kids were really ripped, you wouldn't be that surprised, because we look at a bodybuilder and go, well, if they're world class, there's something about their genetics that probably predispose them to be able to build muscles more effectively or bigger or whatever than maybe everybody else. Their mixture of codes, it gave them that advantage. Well, what LaMarck would have seen from that is that by building up his muscles over his lifetime, Schwarzenegger's kids would be born with more developed muscles than other kids would. They would be given a leg up because they would pick up the traits that the parents had built up over time, acquired characteristics. And when you look at it, sometimes it does look that way. Here was the classic example he gave. The ancestors of giraffes look somewhat like camels. Short necks, relatively short legs. And what LaMarck said, what made those animals eventually be giraffes, is that every generation, the groups were living in a forest where the leaves were a little harder to reach and they would stretch for them. And he knew, postmodernism, that if you took people and you put them on the rack to torture them, that they actually came out taller, that stretching could actually make you taller. But his idea was getting taller over their lifetime. When they had babies, the babies would be built a little longer, a little taller, than babies in the previous generation, because they were picking up this thing that the parents had done to themselves and passing it on to their offspring. That was the big thing. Genetics doesn't work that way. And so he kind of got linked to these two kind of bad ideas. But his basic ideas about advantages and passing things on to offspring turned out to be really, really, really important. Now this sets up Charles Darwin, which we're going to hit in the next video.